Deep in the heart of the Pacific Northwest, where the trees grow so tall they seem to scrape the sky, there lies a forest that doesn't belong to this world. The locals call it Black Pines, but it's not the towering evergreens or the thick underbrush that gives it its name. It's the darkness that lives there, a darkness so deep, so ancient it feels alive. They say the forest breathes. They say it watches. And they say it hungers. The FBI won't go near it. Not after what happened in 1983, when a team of agents vanished while searching for a missing family. The official report blamed it on natural hazards, but the locals know better. They've seen the lights that flicker between the trees, heard the whispers that echo in the wind, and felt the cold, unblinking gaze of something that shouldn't exist. Black Pines doesn't give up its secrets. It takes them. It was a crisp October morning when Sarah Mitchell first heard about Black Pines. She was a freelance journalist, always chasing the next big story, and this one had all the makings of a hit. A haunted forest, a government cover-up, and a trail of disappearances that stretched back over a century. She'd been skeptical at first, but the more she dug, the more she realized there was something here. Something real. The locals were reluctant to talk. They'd glance over their shoulders, lower their voices, and change the subject whenever she brought up the forest. But one man, an old logger named Hank, was willing to share what he knew. He'd worked in Black Pines back in the 70s, before the logging company pulled out, claiming the area was unfit for operations. Hank's eyes grew distant as he spoke, his voice trembling with every word. "You don't go into Black Pines," he said, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. "Not unless you're looking to die. That place, it ain't right. The trees, they move when you ain't looking. And the air, it gets so thick you can't breathe. I seen things in there, things I can't explain. Lights that don't come from no fire. Voices that don't come from no man. And the shadows. God help you if the shadows catch you." Sarah pressed him for more, but Hank clammed up, his face pale and drawn. "You want to know what's in there?" he said finally. "Go see for yourself. But don't say I didn't warn you." That night, Sarah lay awake in her motel room, her mind racing. She'd always been a rational person, a skeptic. But there was something about Hank's story that got under her skin. The way he'd looked at her, like he was already mourning her. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was right, that Black Pines was more than just a story. It was a warning. The next morning she packed her gear, a camera, a voice recorder, a flashlight, and a knife just in case. She drove to the edge of the forest, where the road ended and the trees began. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the sunlight barely penetrated the canopy above. She stepped out of her car, her boots crunching on the gravel, and took a deep breath. This was it. The story of a lifetime. The first few hours were uneventful. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves underfoot. But as she ventured deeper, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew colder, the light dimmer, and the trees, they seemed closer together, their branches twisted and gnarled like the fingers of a giant hand. She checked her compass, but the needle spun wildly, refusing to settle. She pulled out her phone, but there was no signal. She was on her own. It wasn't long before she noticed the first strange thing. A set of footprints in the mud, too large to be human. They led off the path and into the trees, and against her better judgment, she followed them. The forest grew darker as she walked, the trees pressing in on all sides, and the air grew heavier, harder to breathe. She felt like she was being watched, but every time she turned around, there was nothing there. And then she heard it, a low, guttural growl, like the sound of a predator stalking its prey. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest, and slowly turned toward the sound. There, between the trees, was a pair of glowing eyes, watching her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. She took a step back, her hand tightening around the knife, but the eyes didn't move. They just stared, unblinking, as if waiting for her to make the first move. She didn't wait to find out what would happen next. She turned and ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she crashed through the underbrush. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees twisting and turning, the shadows stretching and reaching. She could hear something behind her, something big, and she didn't dare look back. She just ran, her heart pounding in her ears, until she burst into a clearing and stumbled to a stop. The clearing was empty, save for a single tree in the center. It was unlike any tree she'd ever seen. Its bark was black and smooth like polished obsidian, and its branches were bare, twisted into grotesque shapes. At its base was a pile of bones, bleached white by the sun, and scattered among them were objects that made her stomach churn. A child's doll, a rusted pocket knife, a pair of glasses. This wasn't just a tree. It was a shrine. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the truth. Black Pines wasn't just haunted, it was alive. And it had been waiting for her. Sarah stood frozen in the clearing, her eyes locked on the grotesque tree at its center. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the silence was deafening. She could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on her, its gaze unrelenting. The glowing eyes she'd seen earlier were gone, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left. If anything, it had grown stronger. She took a step closer to the tree, her boots crunching on the brittle bones beneath her feet. The objects scattered around its base seemed to call to her, each one a piece of someone's story, a story that had ended here in this cursed place. She knelt down, her hand trembling as she reached for the child's doll. Its face was cracked and faded, its glassy eyes staring up at her with an eerie lifelike quality. She dropped it immediately, her breath catching in her throat. The doll's head had turned to follow her movement. "This isn't real," she whispered to herself, though the words felt hollow. "This can't be real." But it was. The forest was alive and it was toying with her. Sarah's instincts screamed at her to run, to leave this place and never look back. But she couldn't. She was a journalist and this was the story of a lifetime. She pulled out her camera and began to document the scene, her hands shaking as she adjusted the focus. The flash illuminated the clearing, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to move on their own. She snapped a few photos, her heart pounding with each click of the shutter. And then she heard it, a voice, faint and distant, like a whisper carried on the wind. It was coming from the tree. "Help us." Sarah froze, her blood turning to ice. The voice was unmistakable. It was human. She turned toward the tree, her camera still in hand, and saw something that made her stomach churn. The black bark was shifting, rippling like water, and within it she could see faces, dozens of them, their expressions twisted in agony. They were trapped, their mouths moving in silent screams, their eyes pleading for release.
"Help us!" The voice came again, louder this time. Sarah stumbled back, her mind racing. This wasn't just a haunted forest. It was a prison, a place where souls were trapped and tormented. She didn't know how or why, but she knew she had to do something. She couldn't just leave them here. As she turned to leave the clearing, the forest seemed to come alive around her. The trees creaked and groaned, their branches twisting and reaching like skeletal hands. The air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, overlapping and chaotic. She ran, her heart pounding in her chest, but no matter how fast she moved, the forest seemed to stretch on forever. The path she followed was gone, swallowed by the darkness, and the trees all looked the same, twisted, gnarled, and suffocating. She pulled out her compass, but the needle spun wildly, just as it had before. Her phone was still useless, the screen flickering with static. She was lost, and the forest knew it. And then she saw it, a light, flickering between the trees. It was faint, but it was there. She ran toward it, her legs burning with exertion, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The light grew brighter as she approached, and she realized it was coming from a cabin. It was old and dilapidated, its windows cracked and its roof sagging, but it was real. She burst through the door, slamming it shut behind her, and leaned against it, her chest heaving. The cabin was empty, save for a single chair in the corner. On the chair was a journal, its pages yellowed with age. Sarah picked it up, her hands trembling, and began to read. The journal belonged to a man named Thomas Grayson, a logger who had worked in Black Pines in the early 1900s. He wrote of the strange occurrences he'd witnessed, the moving shadows, the whispers in the wind, the lights that danced between the trees. He believed the forest was cursed, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. He tried to warn the others, but they'd laughed at him, calling him superstitious. And then, one by one, they began to disappear. The final entry was written in a shaky hand, the ink smeared as if by tears. "I can hear them calling to me. They want me to join them. But I won't. I can't. The forest is alive, and it's hungry. It feeds on fear, on pain, on souls. It will never let me go. God help me, it will never let me go." Sarah closed the journal, her mind racing. She didn't know how long ago Thomas had written those words, but one thing was clear: he never left the cabin. And neither would she, if she didn't find a way out. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the cabin began to shake. The walls groaned, the floorboards creaked, and the light flickered and died. Sarah was plunged into darkness, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. She fumbled for her flashlight, her hands shaking, and turned it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the cabin's interior. And then she saw it, a figure, standing in the corner, its face obscured by shadows. "Help us!" it whispered, its voice echoing in the small space. Sarah screamed, dropping the flashlight, and stumbled back. The figure moved toward her, its steps slow and deliberate, and she realized with horror that it wasn't alone. The cabin was filled with them, dozens of shadowy figures, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes hollow and lifeless. They reached for her, their fingers brushing against her skin, and she felt their pain, their anger, their despair. She turned and ran, bursting through the cabin door and into the forest. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches clawing at her skin, their roots tripping her feet. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she had to get out. She had to escape. And then, just as she thought she couldn't run anymore, she saw it, a break in the trees, a sliver of sunlight. She pushed herself harder, her legs burning with exertion, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She burst into the sunlight, collapsing onto the gravel road, and lay there, her chest heaving, her heart pounding. She was out. She was free. But as she looked back at the forest, she realized the truth. Black Pines wasn't done with her. The shadows still lingered in the corners of her vision, the whispers still echoed in her ears, and the faces were still there, etched into her memory. She didn't know how long she had, but she knew one thing for certain: the forest would come for her again. And when it did, she wouldn't be able to run. Subscribe for more chilling tales from the shadows of history.